You know how some days feel like they're wrapped in a strange energy, like the universe is trying to warn you about something? Looking back, that Tuesday had all the signs, but I ignored them. I remember sitting in the precinct, watching the clock tick down. My shift had wrapped early, a rare thing in my line of work. I thought, hell, why not go home and surprise Emily for once? I grabbed her favorite tiramisu on the way home. I was even humming to myself, a bad habit I picked up from my late grandfather. The sun was still hanging low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. It felt good to breathe, good to think about something other than suspects and paperwork. That feeling lasted exactly until I opened my front door. It hit me immediately, the tension in the air. The house was too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the eerie, unnatural kind that crawls under your skin and makes the hair on your arms stand up. I stood in the doorway, listening, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. Then I heard it. Footsteps upstairs, followed by a man's laugh. My body locked up. My mind raced, flipping through possibilities. Maybe it was a friend stopping by. Maybe. But no. There was something intimate in that laugh. Something that didn't belong in my home. My pulse thudded in my ears as I climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the bedroom door, I didn't knock. I just pushed it open. Time slowed. Emily was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face frozen in shock. Officer Derek Miles, my colleague, was scrambling to pull on his pants. His face was a mix of panic and shame, his hands trembling as he tried to explain. Mike, it's not what it looks like. I didn't hear the rest. My eyes were locked on Emily. She wasn't even crying yet. She just stared at me, her lips slightly parted, as if she couldn't believe I was standing there. For a moment I thought I might explode. Every muscle in my body was coiled, ready to lash out. I wanted to hit him. God, I wanted to hit him so badly it hurt. But I didn't. I just turned around and walked out. I heard Emily call after me, her voice cracking, but I didn't stop. I made it to my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My heart was racing, and for a second, I thought I might pass out. I sat there in the driveway, staring at the house we'd made a home together. The place where we'd celebrated anniversaries, Christmas mornings, lazy Sundays with coffee and pancakes. It didn't feel like my house anymore. Felt like a crime scene. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw Emily's name on the screen. I didn't answer. Instead, I started the car and drove. I drove for hours, not knowing where the hell I was going. The city lights faded behind me, replaced by open fields and winding country roads. I passed gas stations, roadside diners, and endless stretches of nothingness. Part of me wanted to keep driving until I hit the ocean. Another part of me wanted to pull over and scream until my throat was raw. Instead, I found myself on a familiar road, the one that led to my grandfather's old farmhouse. I hadn't been there in years, not since he passed away. The house had been sitting empty ever since, slowly decaying, waiting for someone to remember it existed. I hadn't planned on coming here, but once I saw it, I couldn't leave. The place looked worse than I remembered. The paint was peeling, the roof sagged in places, and the front porch was covered in leaves and debris. The windows were dirty, reflecting the stormy sky like dull mirrors. Felt like a reflection of me, broken, forgotten, barely standing. I got out of the car and stood in the driveway, listening to the wind whistle through the trees. For the first time all day, the knot in my chest loosened just a little. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to breathe. The first night in the farmhouse was rough. The old place creaked and groaned with every gust of wind. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm outside. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emily and Derek, tangled in sheets that used to feel like home. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and wandered through the house, flashlight in hand. Dust covered everything: furniture, picture frames, the old record player my grandfather used to love. I found a box of his tools in the basement and carried it upstairs. If I wasn't going to sleep, I might as well fix something. I started with the front door. The hinges were loose, and it stuck when you tried to open it. I tightened the screws, sanded the edges, and by the time I was done, the door swung open smoothly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. By morning, I felt lighter. Not better, but lighter. I made a pot of coffee and sat on the front porch, watching the sun rise over the fields. The air smelled like rain and earth. I knew I couldn't run forever. Eventually, I'd have to face Emily, figure out what came next. But for now, I had the house. I had work to do, and that was enough. When you've been betrayed by the person you trust the most, it feels like the ground's been ripped out from under you. There's nothing solid left to stand on, no place to call safe. So you drift. You go wherever your mind takes you. Away from the familiar, away from everything that reminds you of what you just lost. That's how I ended up at my grandfather's house, that creaky old farmhouse at the edge of town. I hadn't thought about the place in years. Honestly, I was surprised it was still standing. The last time I'd been there was for the funeral. Afterward, I couldn't bring myself to go back. The house felt too empty without him in it. He was one of those larger-than-life guys. A mechanic who could build damn near anything with his hands, always with a grease-stained grin and some old jazz record playing in the background. As kids, my brother and I spent every summer at the farmhouse. We'd fish at the nearby creek, catch fireflies at dusk, and build tree forts in the woods. My grandfather would sit on the porch, smoking his pipe, and call us back when it got too dark. The house used to feel alive back then, full of life and laughter. Now it felt like a ghost. The front porch sagged under my weight as I stepped up. Weeds had taken over the front yard, twisting around the porch rails like they were trying to pull the house into the earth. The windows were cloudy, hiding whatever secrets the house had collected over the years. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was thick and stale, heavy with dust and memories. My footsteps echoed through the empty rooms. The living room still had the same faded floral couch and the old wood-burning stove. A few pictures hung on the walls. My grandfather and me fishing, my grandparents at their wedding. It hit me harder than I expected. I stood there for a minute, staring at those pictures, feeling the weight of time settle on my shoulders. Then something clicked. I didn't have control over much in my life right now. My marriage? Gone. My career? Hanging by a thread. But this house? This mess of wood and nails and broken dreams? This I could fix. The first project I tackled was the roof. It had been leaking for years, and part of the ceiling in the upstairs bedroom had caved in. I went to the hardware store and loaded up on shingles, nails, and every tool I thought I might need. I spent the next 2 days on that roof, ripping off the old shingles, patching holes, and hammering down new ones. It was hard work. The kind that leaves your arms aching and your back screaming for mercy. But it was exactly what I needed. Every swing of the hammer felt like I was driving out another piece of anger. Every nail was another stitch, holding me together just a little tighter. The thing about old houses is that they fight you every step of the way. Nothing's square, nothing's level. The beams are warped, and the wiring looks like it was done by a drunk raccoon. But slowly, bit by bit, the house started to take shape. And so did I. The house kept me busy for the next week. I replaced broken windows, scrubbed decades of grime off the floors, and sanded down the old banister in the front hall. I barely slept. Every time I felt that familiar weight in my chest, the rage, the sadness, I grabbed a tool and worked until I couldn't feel anything anymore. I didn't talk to anyone. Not my friends, not my colleagues. Not Emily. I just needed to be alone with the house and my thoughts. But the thing about isolation is that it gives your mind too much room to wander. Late at night, when the house was quiet and I couldn't sleep, I'd sit on the porch with a beer and replay that moment over and over again. Emily and Derek. The look on her face when she saw me. The sickening realization that everything we had was just gone. They ate at me. I thought about calling her. 6 times. I picked up the phone, thumb hovering over her name. But what would I even say? Why did you do it? When did it start? Was there ever a moment when you stopped loving me? I knew those questions would only lead to answers I didn't want. One night, after a long day of replacing the bathroom tile, I found myself digging through the boxes in the basement. Most of it was old junk, Fishing gear, rusted tools, stacks of yellowed newspapers. But then I found the box. It was tucked in the corner, covered in cobwebs. My grandfather's keepsake box. Inside were all the little treasures he'd collected over the years. Postcards from places he'd traveled, photos of him and my grandmother, a pocket knife with his initials engraved on the handle. At the bottom of the box was a note in his handwriting. "You can rebuild anything if you've got the heart for it." I sat there on the basement floor, holding that note, and for the first time in days, I felt something other than anger. I felt hope. The next morning, I made a decision. This house wasn't just a place to hide. It was a second chance. A chance to rebuild something real, something that couldn't be taken away. I didn't know where the road would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to follow it. It's funny how life throws curveballs at you just when you think you've had enough. There I was, knee-deep in drywall dust and old plaster, working on the house like it was my lifeline. Every day, I'd throw myself into fixing something else. Anything to keep my mind from spiraling. I wasn't sleeping much, and my diet was basically coffee and whatever expired cans I found in the pantry. I told myself I didn't need anyone, that isolation was part of the healing process. But I guess life had other plans. It happened late on a Thursday evening. The sky was darkening fast, and fat raindrops were already spattering the windshield of my truck as I drove down a back road toward town. I had a list of supplies I needed for the kitchen: grout, new cabinet hinges, sandpaper. The kind of mundane stuff that had become the center of my world lately. I almost missed it. A flash of silver caught my eye through the rain. A car crumpled against a tree at the edge of the road, steam rising from the hood. I hit the brakes and pulled over. The driver's side door was open, and through the blur of rain, I saw a figure sitting inside, motionless. Grabbing my jacket, I jogged toward the car. The woman behind the wheel looked up as I tapped on the window, her eyes wide and startled. She had a phone in her hand, but it was dead, just like the hopeless look on her face. "You all right?" I asked, leaning down. She nodded slowly, blinking rain out of her eyes. "Yeah, I think so. My phone's dead, though. Can you call a tow truck?" "Of course," I said. "But let's get you out of the rain first." She hesitated for a second, then took my hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly as she climbed out of the car. We sat in my truck while we waited for the tow. I cranked up the heat, and after a minute, she relaxed a little, brushing rain-slicked hair away from her face. She looked around the cab, probably taking in the dust and random tools scattered across the seats. "Nice setup," she said with a small smile. "Carpenter or serial killer?" I laughed for the first time in what felt like months. "Just a guy with a broken house." She introduced herself as Lisa. She'd moved to town recently and was still figuring out the area. We talked to pass the time, about the storm, the terrible cell service out here, the town's one decent coffee shop. The kind of easy, surface-level stuff you share with strangers. But there was something about her that made it feel natural. "I was heading home from a client meeting," she said, holding her hands out to the heater vents. "Lost control on that last turn. This place is beautiful, but it's a death trap when it rains." I nodded. "That curve's taken out more cars than I can count. You're lucky it wasn't worse." "Yeah," she said, looking out at the rain. "I guess I am." When the tow truck finally arrived, she turned to me, her face softening. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped." I shrugged. "No big deal. Right place, right time." "Still," she said, "can I get your number? Just in case I ever need rescuing again." I gave it to her, watching as she typed it into her phone. She smiled, tucked her phone into her pocket, and waved as she climbed into the tow truck. And just like that, she was gone. I didn't think much of it at first. Just a random encounter. But 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a text. "Hey, it's Lisa. Thanks again for the rescue. I owe you a coffee." I stared at the message for a while before responding. "How about a beer instead?" We met at a little bar in town that night. The kind of place with creaky floors and neon signs that buzzed just a little too loud. Lisa was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table by the window with 2 beers in front of her. She waved me over with that same easy smile. We talked for hours. She told me about her life, how she'd grown up in the city but moved here for a fresh start. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, mostly for small businesses, and loved the flexibility it gave her. I told her about the house, about how I was trying to fix it up. I left out the mess with Emily. It felt too raw, too personal to share with someone I just met. But Lisa didn't press. She just listened, nodding in all the right places, laughing when I told her about the raccoon that had somehow made its way into the attic. Felt good. It wasn't a date. Not really. But it also didn't feel like just two strangers passing time. There was something there, a connection, maybe, a thread that felt strong enough to hold on to. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm. Lisa and I texted here and there. Sometimes we'd meet for coffee or a beer. Sometimes she'd swing by the house to check on my progress, offering advice on paint colors and light fixtures. I found myself looking forward to those moments. She was easy to talk to, easy to be around. She didn't ask for more than I could give, didn't push for details about my past. She was just there, steady and warm, like an anchor in the storm. And for the first time since everything with Emily blew up, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't completely lost. It's strange how some people walk into your life at exactly the right time. Like they were waiting off stage, just out of sight, until the moment you needed them most. That's what Lisa was to me. A quiet presence that slowly grew into something steady and dependable. She didn't press or pry. She didn't try to fix me either. She just showed up, little by little, and filled the empty spaces in my life without even realizing she was doing it. The house was finally starting to take shape. I'd rebuilt the roof, patched the walls, and given the old hardwood floors a new life. It still wasn't perfect, it probably never would be, but it felt like progress. Lisa started coming by more often, especially on weekends. At first, it was casual, dropping off coffee, sticking around to chat for a bit. But before I knew it, she was helping me strip paint from the old kitchen cabinets, picking out new light fixtures, and arguing with me about whether or not the living room needed an area rug. "It ties the room together," she insisted one afternoon, standing in the middle of the living room with her arms crossed. "It's just another thing for me to trip over," I said, shaking my head. "Pass." She laughed, tossing a pillow at me. "You have no vision, Michael." None. Maybe I didn't, but I was starting to see things more clearly than I had in months. One Saturday, we decided to tackle the front porch. It was a mess of rotted wood and loose railings, dangerous even. We spent the entire day tearing it down and replacing the worst sections, our hands covered in sawdust and dirt. By the time we finished, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. We sat on the steps, drinking beers and watching the light fade. "You've done a hell of a job with this place," Lisa said, stretching her legs out in front of her. "It's starting to feel like a home again." I nodded, taking a sip of my beer. "It's getting there." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the crickets and the distant hum of cicadas. Then she spoke again, her voice softer this time. "You don't talk about your past much." It wasn't a question, just an observation. But it still hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at the beer in my hand, swirling the liquid around the bottle. Not much to say. Lisa didn't push. She just waited, giving me space to find the words. "My wife cheated on me," I finally said. The words tasted bitter in my mouth, like I was spitting out poison. "With someone I worked with." I walked in on them, right there in my house. I didn't look at her. Couldn't. I just kept talking, the words pouring out before I could stop them. I walked out, drove around for hours, and ended up here. Figured if I could fix the house, maybe I could fix myself too. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Then Lisa reached over and rested her hand on mine. "I'm sorry," she said. Her hand was warm, steady. I didn't realize how much I'd needed that simple touch until it was there. "Thanks," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. After that night, things between us shifted. It wasn't drastic. There was no grand declaration, no sudden romance. It was something quieter, something that felt more real. We kept working on the house together, but now there was a new layer of understanding between us. She knew about my past, and I knew enough about hers to understand that she wasn't here to fix me. She was just here. One afternoon, while we were repainting the living room, she put on an old playlist from her phone. Everything from 70s rock to indie folk. "This is a vibe," she said, grinning as she danced around with a paintbrush in her hand. I laughed, watching her spin in circles, her bare feet leaving faint footprints on the tarp we'd spread across the floor. "You're ridiculous," I said, shaking my head. "You love it," she shot back, winking. I couldn't argue with that. But even as things with Lisa grew easier, the weight of my past still hung in the background like a storm cloud waiting to break. I started having dreams. Vivid ones that left me breathless and shaken. In them, I was back in my old house, standing in the doorway of my bedroom, watching Emily and Derek. No matter how many times I tried to turn away, my feet were stuck, my voice caught in my throat. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. Some nights, I'd sit on the porch for hours afterward, staring out at the darkness, trying to convince myself that those ghosts couldn't follow me here. Lisa noticed, of course. She always noticed. "You're not sleeping," she said one evening, her eyes searching mine. "I'm fine ilid." She didn't believe me, but she didn't push. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs. "When I was a kid, my mom always said that bad dreams are just your brain's way of trying to clean house. You have to let them run their course." "Sounds exhausting." "It is," she said with a soft smile. "But it's worth it." I nodded, trying to believe her. It wasn't until a few nights later that I finally let myself exhale. We were sitting on the porch again, another round of beers in our hands. The sky was clear, the stars bright above us. Lisa leaned back, her head resting against the railing. "Do you ever wonder what's next?" "All the time," I said. She turned to look at me, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Maybe it's not about figuring it all out right now. Maybe it's just about taking it one step at a time." I smiled, feeling something shift inside me. "One step at a time," I repeated. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed it might actually be possible. It wasn't supposed to get complicated. At first, Lisa was just a breath of fresh air, someone to distract me from everything I didn't want to think about. We were friends. Hell, I needed a friend. Nothing more, nothing less. But life has a funny way of pushing you toward the one thing you think you're not ready for. Lisa had become a part of my routine without me even realizing it. She knew which cabinet the coffee mugs were in, brought over paint swatches without asking, and called me out when I started sinking back into myself. Felt easy. Felt right. But right doesn't always mean simple. The first time I caught myself staring at her a little too long, I brushed it off. It was late, and we'd been working on the upstairs bathroom all day. Lisa had some kind of ridiculous talent for fixing things, way better with a wrench than me if I'm being honest. She was crouched over the vanity, tightening the last bolt on the new sink, her hair falling into her face. "Done?" she said, wiping her hands on a rag and flashing me that grin, the one that had become way too familiar. "Not bad," I said, crossing my arms. "For an amateur." She rolled her eyes and tossed the rag at me. "Please, you'd still be trying to read the instructions if it weren't for me." I laughed, catching the rag, but my smile faded as I watched her. The way her eyes lit up when she was proud of herself, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. Small things, things I wasn't supposed to notice. I cleared my throat and looked away. It was nothing, just a fluke. But it wasn't. The second time it happened, there was no brushing it off. It was a Friday night, and we decided to take a break from house projects. We drove into town and grabbed dinner at a little burger joint, the kind of no-frills place with plastic trays and milkshakes that tasted like childhood. Afterward, we walked through the park, the air cool and crisp, the smell of leaves lingering in the air. We talked about everything and nothing, the kind of easy conversation that felt like slipping into an old, worn-in jacket. Then we stopped by the fountain in the center of the park. "Make a wish," Lisa said, fishing a coin from her pocket and holding it out to me. I stared at the coin for a second, then took it. What the hell do I wish for? For the pain to stop? For a reset button? For my life to feel like my own again? I tossed the coin into the fountain, watching it disappear beneath the ripples. "What did you wish for?" she asked, her eyes sparkling under the streetlights. I shook my head, a faint smile tugging at my lips. "Can't tell you that. Bad luck." She laughed. "Fair enough." We stood there for a moment, the night stretching out around us. The world felt smaller somehow, quieter, like it was just the two of us. I could feel the warmth of her standing next to me, the soft rise and fall of her breath. And that's when it hit me. I liked her, more than liked her. I leaned in, almost without thinking, but at the last second, I pulled back, my heart hammering in my chest. "Mike," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I took a step back, running a hand through my hair. "Sorry, I should get going." Her face fell just a little, but she covered it with a smile. "Yeah, of course." For the next few days, I threw myself back into work on the house. I needed to clear my head, figure out what the hell I was doing. Lisa deserved better than to be some rebound, some half-baked attempt at fixing myself. But the thing is, once you see something, you can't unsee it. Every time she showed up at the house, every time she laughed at one of my bad jokes or brushed past me in the kitchen, I felt it. That pull terrified me. One night, after a long day of replacing the back deck, Lisa stayed for dinner. I made pasta, one of the only things I actually knew how to cook. We ate in the kitchen, the air warm and filled with the smell of garlic and basil. She leaned back in her chair, swirling the last of her wine in her glass. "You know, you're not as hopeless as I thought." "High praise," I said, raising an eyebrow. "I mean it," she said, her voice softening. "When I met you, you looked lost. But now, you're getting your feet under you again." "Feels that way sometimes," I admitted. "Then there are days where it feels like the ground's still shifting beneath me." "That's how it goes," she said, setting her glass down. "Healing isn't a straight line." I nodded, letting her words settle. We sat there in silence for a moment, the air between us thick with something unspoken. Then she reached across the table and took my hand. "Whatever happens," she said, her eyes locking on mine, "I'm here." Something broke inside me then. All the walls I'd built, all the defenses I'd wrapped around myself, they crumbled in an instant. I squeezed her hand, my throat tight. "Thank you." Later that night, after she'd gone home, I sat on the porch, staring out at the stars. I knew I couldn't keep running from this. Whatever it was between us, it was real. But real didn't mean simple. And as much as I wanted to lean into it, a part of me still held back, haunted by everything that had come before. It's funny how life lets you breathe just long enough to forget how easily the ground can shift beneath you. For weeks, things felt good, better than they had in a long time. The house was coming together, the nightmares were less frequent, and Lisa had become a constant. A steady heartbeat in my otherwise chaotic life. But the past doesn't just let you go. It circles like a vulture, waiting for the perfect moment to remind you it's still there. The first crack in the foundation came in the form of a text. I was standing in the kitchen, staring at a half-painted cabinet door, when my phone buzzed on the counter. I expected it to be Lisa, maybe sending me another picture of some wild color swatch she thought I'd hate. Instead, it was a number I hadn't seen in months. "We need to talk. Please. Emily." My stomach twisted into a knot. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to ignore it, pretend it didn't exist. But another part of me knew better. I couldn't avoid her forever. We met the next day at a coffee shop on the far side of town. Neutral ground. Emily was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. She looked tired. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and there were faint shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Mike," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "Thanks for coming." I nodded, sliding into the chair across from her. "What's this about?" She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the mug. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, and I realized there are things I never said, things I need to say. I leaned back, crossing my arms.
I'm listening.
I'm sorry, she said, her eyes locking on mine. I know that doesn't change anything, but I need you to know how sorry I am. For everything. Her words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. I never wanted to hurt you, she continued, her voice cracking. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. And instead of talking to you about it, I made the worst mistake of my life. I watched her, searching for the anger that had always been there when I thought about her betrayal. But it wasn't there. Not anymore. I loved you, I said quietly. I would have fought for us. But you didn't give me the chance. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. I know. And that's something I'll regret for the rest of my life. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the hum of the coffee shop around us. I'm not here to ask for anything, she said finally. I needed to say it. To give you some kind of closure, if that's even possible. Closure. It was such a simple word, but it carried more weight than I was prepared for. Thank you, I said, meaning it. Emily nodded, wiping at her eyes. Take care of yourself, Mike. And just like that, she was gone. I sat there for a while after she left, staring at my coffee, trying to process what had just happened. For months, I'd carried the weight of everything she'd done. Let it define me, shape every decision I made. And now, with just a few words, she'd taken some of that weight back. It was strange, feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. I wanted to tell Lisa. She'd understand. She always did. But something held me back. Maybe it was the fear that talking about Emily would bring all those ghosts back to life. Or maybe it was something deeper, something I wasn't ready to admit. Lisa showed up at the house later that evening, a bottle of wine in one hand and takeout in the other. Figured you could use a break, she said, smiling as she stepped inside. Perfect timing, I said, taking the takeout from her. I was just about to eat cereal for dinner. We sat on the couch, eating straight from the takeout containers, the bottle of wine sitting open on the coffee table. Lisa told me about a nightmare client she was dealing with, a restaurant owner who couldn't decide what kind of logo he wanted. He's changed his mind 5 times in 2 days, she said, rolling her eyes. I'm pretty sure he's just making it up as he goes. I laughed, shaking my head. Sounds like a blast. Oh, it is. It's like a roller coaster of indecision. We fell into an easy rhythm, the conversation flowing like it always did. But even as I laughed at her stories, part of my mind was still stuck in that coffee shop with Emily. At some point, Lisa must have noticed, because she set her container down and leaned in, her eyes searching mine. Hey, she said softly. Where'd you go just now? I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. I ran into Emily today. Her expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker behind her eyes. Oh, she wanted to apologize, I said. Give me some kind of closure, I guess. And did it help? I think so, I said. It's just a lot to process. Lisa nodded, her hand resting on my knee. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I covered her hand with mine, squeezing it gently. Thank you. We sat there in silence for a while, the only sound the soft hum of the fridge in the next room. But even as I sat there with Lisa, feeling the warmth of her hand beneath mine, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath me was shifting again. At first, I thought everything would go back to normal after I told Lisa about Emily. She was calm, understanding, like she always was. But something changed after that night, something small but undeniable. It was in the pauses between our conversations, in the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. I told myself it was nothing, a blip, but deep down I knew better. Lisa had been my constant, my anchor in the storm. I leaned on her more than I realized, maybe more than I should have. And now it felt like that foundation was starting to crack. It wasn't just her, though. The truth is, I wasn't fully present either. My run-in with Emily stirred up things I thought I'd buried. Questions I couldn't answer. feelings I couldn't shake. I tried to push it all down, keep moving forward, but it felt like I was trying to walk with a stone tied to my chest. Lisa noticed, of course. She always noticed. It came to a head one rainy evening in late November. Lisa was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. I stood at the counter watching her, trying to figure out how to bridge the growing gap between us. "You've been quiet lately," she said without looking up. "Just a lot on my mind," I said. She nodded, slicing through a bell pepper. "Want to talk about it?" I hesitated. "It's nothing serious." She set the knife down and turned to face me, crossing her arms. "Mike, come on. We've been here before. I know when you're shutting down on me." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I'm not shutting down. I'm just trying to figure some things out." "Like what?" "Like, where I go from here. What the hell I'm supposed to do with my life now that everything's different." Her eyes softened, but there was something else there, too. Something guarded. "I get that. I really do. But you don't have to figure it out alone." "I know," I said quickly. "And I'm not trying to shut you out. I just need some space to think." Lisa nodded slowly, but I could see the hurt flicker across her face. "Space, huh? It's not like that," I said, stepping closer. "I just need to sort through some things. I'm trying to be honest with you." "I appreciate that," she said, her voice quieter now. "But it feels like you're not sure if you want me to be part of whatever comes next." Her words hit harder than I expected because there was truth in them. I wasn't unsure about her. I was unsure about me. "Lisa, I started," but she shook her head. "It's okay," she said, forcing a smile. "Really, take your time. Figure things out." I wanted to tell her I wasn't going anywhere, that this was just a rough patch, but the words stuck in my throat. Over the next few weeks, the distance between us grew. Lisa stopped coming by the house as often. Our texts became shorter, less frequent. We both pretended everything was fine, but it wasn't. I spent more time alone, throwing myself into the last few house projects, the ones I'd been avoiding. The attic, the back hallway, the guest room. They were small jobs, but they kept my hands busy, which was all I needed. Sometimes, I'd catch myself staring at my phone, wanting to text her, to tell her I missed her, but I always stopped short. What if I can't give her what she needs? One night, I found myself sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by old photos I'd found in the attic. Pictures of my grandfather, my parents, and a few of Emily and me back when things were good. I picked up one of the photos, studying our faces. We looked happy, carefree, like two people who had the world ahead of them. I barely recognized us. The knock on the door startled me. I got up, wiping my hands on my jeans, and opened it to find Lisa standing there, her hair damp from the rain. "Hey," she said, her voice soft. "Hey," I said, stepping aside to let her in. She stood in the middle of the living room, her eyes drifting over the photos scattered on the floor. "Memory lane? Something like that." She nodded, taking a deep breath. "We need to talk." I braced myself. "Okay." Lisa crossed her arms, her eyes locking on mine. "I care about you, Mike, more than I probably should, and I've tried to be patient to give you space, but I need to know where we stand." "I care about you too," I said quickly. "You've been everything to me." "But," she said, tilting her head. "But I'm still figuring things out," I admitted. "I don't want to drag you into my mess. You deserve more than that." Lisa smiled sadly. "You're not dragging me into anything, Mike. I walked into this with my eyes open. But if you're not ready for more, I need to know that. I need to protect myself, too." Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. "I don't want to lose you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You won't," she said. "But maybe we both need some time to figure out what we really want." I nodded, my chest tightening. "Yeah, maybe." Lisa leaned in and kissed me on the cheek, her lips warm against my skin. "Take care of yourself," she said, her voice soft but steady. And then she was gone. That night, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. I sat on the floor for hours, staring at the door, waiting for her to come back. But she didn't. I told myself it was temporary, that we just needed time. But deep down, I wasn't sure if time would be enough. I thought I was good at being alone. After all, I'd spent months in this house with nothing but peeling wallpaper and the echo of my own thoughts. I thought I had mastered the art of solitude, learned how to live in the quiet spaces, filling them with work and distraction. But after Lisa walked out that night, the quiet changed. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was suffocating. The house seemed bigger, the shadows longer. Every creak in the floorboards felt like a reminder of all the things I hadn't said, all the choices I hadn't made. I tried to focus on the last bits of renovation, touching up paint, fixing a stubborn cabinet door, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. The house was done, but I was far from finished. I kept expecting Lisa to text me, to show up on the porch with that half smile and a sarcastic comment about my terrible taste in rugs. But days passed, then weeks, and there was nothing. Could have reached out. God knows I wanted to. My thumb hovered over her name on my phone more times than I could count. But something stopped me every time. What if it's too late? What if she's already moved on? The house, once my project and my escape, had become a prison. I wandered from room to room, looking for something, anything, to distract me. But the walls just stared back at me, silent and indifferent. One night, I found myself in the attic again, surrounded by boxes of my grandfather's things. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just needed to be somewhere other than the empty rooms below. I opened a dusty old box and found a stack of letters tied together with twine. They were yellowed with age, the handwriting faded but still legible. They were love letters from my grandfather to my grandmother. I sat down on the floor, carefully unfolding the first one. The words were simple but full of life. Stories about their early days, about the struggles they faced, and how they always found their way back to each other. I read letter after letter, each one tugging at something deep inside me. My grandfather had been a man of few words, but on these pages he bared his soul. One line stuck with me. A house is just a house until you fill it with the right people. Without love, it's just walls and a roof. I stared at that sentence for a long time, the words blurring as my eyes filled with tears. I hadn't cried in a long time. Not like that. It wasn't just about Lisa. It was everything, the betrayal, the loss, the fear that I'd spent so much time trying to rebuild myself that I'd forgotten how to live. I sat there in the attic for what felt like hours, letting it all out. And when the tears finally stopped, something shifted. I didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. I didn't want to lose Lisa. Not because she'd saved me, but because she made me want to be more than just the sum of my broken parts. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I grabbed my phone, my heart pounding as I scrolled to Lisa's name. I stared at the screen for a second, then hit call. It rang twice before she picked up. Mike! Her voice was soft, tentative. Hey! I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. Do you have a minute? There was a pause, then a quiet sigh. Yeah. Ido. I've been an idiot, I said, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess them. I've been so scared of messing things up that I ended up doing exactly that. I pushed you away because I didn't want to hurt you, but I hurt you anyway. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Lisa didn't say anything for a moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but tinged with sadness. Mike, I never needed you to have all the answers. I just needed you to let me in. I know, I said, and I want to. I don't have everything figured out, but I'm done running. If you're willing to give me another chance, I want to build something real with you. The silence stretched out again, my heart hammering in my chest. Come over, she said finally. Let's talk. I was at her place within 20 minutes, my pulse racing the entire drive. Lisa opened the door, her eyes soft but wary. I stood there for a second, not sure what to say. Then she stepped aside and pulled me into a hug. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. We sat on her couch for hours, talking about everything. Our fears, our hopes, the messy, complicated road that had led us here. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, No sweeping declarations or Hollywood endings. It was something quieter, something real. We didn't solve everything that night. There were still cracks in the foundation, things we'd have to work through. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the work. I was ready for it. The next few weeks were a new beginning. We took things slow, learning how to be together in a way that felt honest and grounded. The house, once my project and my prison, became a home again, not just because of the work I'd done, but because of the people I was finally letting in. Lisa helped me see that life isn't about fixing everything at once. Sometimes, it's about sitting in the mess and trusting that it's okay to not have all the answers. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The funny thing about healing is that it never happens the way you expect. It doesn't come all at once, wrapped in a neat little package with a bow on top. Comes in pieces, slow, quiet moments when you realize you're not holding your breath anymore. After that night at Lisa's, things didn't magically fall into place. We still had hard conversations. We still stumbled. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of falling because I knew she'd be there to catch me, and I'd be there to catch her, too. We took our time, figuring out what we meant outside the walls of that house. Felt like learning to walk again, one careful step at a time. The house, the one that had started as my escape, was no longer just mine. Lisa helped me finish the last of the renovations. Choosing curtains, arranging furniture, turning it into something warm and alive. It wasn't perfect. Some of the old scars remained. Tiny cracks in the molding, a faint creak in the floorboards, but we decided to leave them. They were part of the story, and stories aren't meant to be flawless. One Sunday afternoon, we were standing in the kitchen, debating whether or not to paint the cabinets again, when Lisa suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "You know," she said, leaning on the counter with that familiar mischievous glint in her eye, "you never did let me pick out a rug for the living room." I laughed, shaking my head. "I knew you'd hold that over me forever. Forever's a long time," she said, grinning. I stepped closer, wrapping my arms around her waist. "Yeah, it is." We stayed like that for a while, the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows, bathing the room in golden light. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt at peace. I saw Emily once more after that. It was in town, outside the coffee shop where we'd met that day. She was sitting at a table with a friend, laughing at something on her phone. She looked happy. For a moment, I thought about going over, saying hello. But then her eyes met mine, and we both froze. She gave me a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of everything we'd been through. I nodded back, and that was it. As I walked away, I realized I felt nothing.
No anger, no sadness.
Just a quiet sense of closure, like a door had finally closed behind me. Lisa and I kept moving forward step by step. We didn't have everything figured out, but we didn't need to. Life wasn't about having all the answers. It was about showing up, day after day, and choosing to stay. One night, as we sat on the front porch with a bottle of wine and a blanket wrapped around our shoulders, Lisa rested her head on my shoulder. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked, her voice soft. "All the time," I said. "What do you see?" I thought about that for a moment, letting the question settle. "I see this," I said, "us figuring it out as we go." She smiled, her fingers lacing through mine. "I like that." "Me too," I said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. The stars sparkled above us, and the night stretched out wide and endless. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't scared of what was ahead. The house had taught me something I never expected. That rebuilding isn't about going back to who you were. It's about becoming someone new, stronger, wiser, and a little more willing to embrace the cracks and imperfections. And that's what we did. We built something new, something real. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And that was enough.